That's a snapshot of what has gone through our lives in the last couple of months. And I wanted to tell the story a little bit personal before I speak to you a little bit about our transition to recovery in the British Virgin Islands. The month of August is our celebration month when we celebrate our emancipation, and it was that morning that we were preparing to celebrate when we got the first warning, flash flood warning in effect, and right after there was lightning, thunder, torrential rains, and all this canceled the major parade of the day. By 6 p.m., the city of Road Town was flooded. Heavy rains continued throughout the night, causing one of the worst floods we ever experienced in the BVI. It was Tuesday morning at about 6 a.m. When there's a good gentleman in that bright shirt there, stand up, Alex. That Tuesday morning, on my way out to go and inspect the roads, Alex bounced me up. I said, Alex, help me get to town. Because there were mountains of dirt all over the roads. Alex went through all kinds of shortcuts and got me to town eventually as roads come under my portfolio. They were blocked with huge piles of silt, some 6 feet or 8 feet high. Homes and businesses on low-lying areas were completely flooded. Thank God there was no loss of life. Soon after that, immediate cleanup and recovery went into effect, clearing roads, guts, and properties. We were just about finished that, and lo and behold, warning to keep an eye on what became Hurricane Irma was sounded by the DDM group. Residents normally, as usual, hopeful that it will pass probably north of us or south of us, eventually got a serious warning 3 days before to prepare for Category 5 hurricane. Preparation became intense. Monday and Tuesday before the storm. By Tuesday night, September 6, residents recognized this one was real. Irma is coming with full force. Everyone was ordered indoors Tuesday night and into early Wednesday morning. Then an ominous warning came about 10 a.m. by a direct telephone call to all the ministers and everyone else concerned from the director of DDM, Ms. Charlene Dabber, with her voice obviously cracking. We could tell it was serious. She sounded the word that Irma had shifted from its path towards our sister island, Antigua in the north, and would be making a direct hit over the capital of Road Town, Tortola, Virgin Gorda, another sister island, and Jos Van Dyke. So said, so done. Within an hour, the winds became stronger and stronger in a northerly to southerly direction. Unprecedented strong winds like we had never experienced before. Then comes the eye of the storm at about 1:15 p.m. for 20 minutes of dead calm and sunshine. Yet overhead lay ominous clouds. A quick check outside my house revealed some destruction had already occurred. I looked down and my premier, who lived just below me, had climbed up on his roof to see how bad it was damaged. And he was climbing back down. I shouted out to him, and he eventually went back down into the house, his house, for shelter. This quick check also revealed the sound, the loud sound, the screaming sound of a lady when I was outside. "Help! Somebody please help!" I looked down and saw a red face, blushing with fear and tears in her eyes. This quick check revealed that it was Miss Charlene Dabrio, who was housed in, her and 24, 25 others were housed in the DDM center, but it was no longer a center at that time. She was outside shouting for rescue. A 10-minute miraculous rescue operation for the DDM team and supporting officials, including the police commissioner, fire and rescue, and other volunteers, totaling about 25, was quickly and miraculously executed. We literally pushed each other up a hill to get to the basement of my house. I recall one lady fell to the ground at that time with an asthmatic attack, and we had to lift her up to safety. We had barely gotten inside. In fact, Alex, again, didn't get inside. He was greeted with a galvanized flying that cut him on his shoulder, and we had to quickly run him down to the hospital, which was not far away. They were housed in my basement, the 25 of them, for the next 4 hours of terror from the sound from the second half of Irma, which was much stronger than the first half. Some praying, some taking turns to hold windows and doors from blowing out. Sometimes a line of us held each other to hold the window or the door from the tornado winds. This was the order of the day for the next 4 hours of Irma. The team effort for protection and survival was amazing. But I will let you know this story was nothing compared to many other stories that we heard from many who barely survived Hurricane Irma. So on the day of September 7th in the year of our Lord 2017, we thank God that only 4 lives were lost as a result of Hurricane Irma, with sustained winds of over 185 miles an hour and gusts in excess of 200 miles an hour. The only thing I can say to you, good folks here, is that you have to live it, literally live it, to believe it and understand it. However, for God's sake, don't wish for anything like it. Then, barely beginning the cleanup from Irma, the recovery and aftershocks of Irma, up comes Miss Maria, another Category 5 hurricane bearing down on the Virgin Islands. And although it passed 80 miles south of us, the heavy surge caused much damage along the south and western coastline of the island of Tortola, especially. By the end of that night of Maria, with its strong winds, the psychological stress factor for many having just experienced Irma up to this day is very hard to overcome. Immediately after the passing of Irma, the assessment of life and injuries was in progress. 2 days later, a reasonable assessment that we had unfortunately lost 4 lives and many injuries, most non-life-threatening, was made. By the following day, the director of the DDM, Ms. Charlene Dabrio, despite, to my amazement, her shocks and dismay, having lost her headquarters, her daughter being in the same room with her at the time, with important emergency communication equipment being lost, Ms. Dabrio swung into action with her team, immediately establishing a new command center in an underutilized portion of the hospital. I remember as she almost tearfully demanded the use of the space for her and her team. This was her addressing the governor and the members of cabinet. This turned out to be one of the best decisions made immediately following the storm. This space became the center of activity for the government in the days following this catastrophic event. Everyone, including the governor, premier, ministers, and House of Assembly representatives, met there daily and sometimes twice a day to make and execute emergency decisions as Ms. Dabria and the team presented those decisions requests to us, especially regarding the safety of residents, survivability, including the provision of water, food, and shelter. The cabinet made decisions at this location daily, and it's probably the first time a cabinet ever did this, and even in the presence of and with input from our opposition members. It was an amazing team effort in those days following, with an amazing DDM team headed by Ms. Charlene Dabro, leading the emergency rescue and recovery efforts. I ask you for a huge round of applause for this team. Thank you. 2 days after Irma hit, the UK military arrived, the ship arrived. I was called by my premier to join him on a helicopter to visit some of our sister islands to assess what had happened there, because we had no communication from them. Rumors had it that the low-lying island of Anegada, which is not more than 20 feet above sea level at any point, was completely wiped out. That was the rumor. On arrival there, the experience I had never been in a helicopter before. They strapped me down to a seat with a helmet and with something on me which they say could float. I wasn't too trusting of it, but I put it on. But that wasn't all. As we were coming down to the island of Anegada, they lowered the helicopter to from about 1,000 feet down to about 500 feet and told me to open the window of the helicopter and look out. It took me a little while to do it, but I did it. But the good thing was that as we did that, we saw all the residents running, coming towards the helicopter. They were not wiped out. They were still alive. Obviously, we were happy to see them. There was some property damage, but nothing major. And after that, we took off to Virgin Gorda, another sister island in Jos van Dijk, where major damages could be seen. Huge destruction and damages to the marine sector was obvious from the air. Boats were piled on each other everywhere, including the main marine hurricane shelter in the Paraquita Bay pond. On the helicopter, we experienced and saw a boat in distress, and a flare went up. We hovered down over the ship, over the boat, to see about 5 persons stranded. I never thought I would join the Army or the Navy, but the helicopter captain said our first mission is rescue. So while you're in the Premier here, you have to join in the rescue. Of course, they opened the helicopter again. One of the co-pilots lowered himself down on some sort of string or ladder while we were in the air hovering over this boat. The good news was, as they visited the boat, that all was safe in the boat, and they just wanted to let us know they were safe, and if you could come back and get them, which eventually we did. So at the end of the day, having told you my personal story, how do we as a country in the Caribbean recover from these events? And how do we as a country in the Caribbean set an example for future events for other countries in the Caribbean and the world over for disasters such as these and others. You heard from our good doctor this morning about some of the things that we have done. I won't go over them. But as a government, we appreciate very much the work that CDEMA and extended to our disaster management team have done in preparing us for these kinds of events, so that right after the event, this team swung into action and the National Emergency Group was operating, and they did a fantastic job during that phase of a disaster. Give them another round of applause for me, if you don't mind. And that round of applause includes CDEMA. And thank you, Mr. Ron Jackson, who showed up. I don't know how we got there so quickly after, but he showed up to help us and stabilize us a little bit there. I want to also remember other prime ministers and other persons in the region, including Steve over there, who came by to give us a little encouragement and assess what was happening. The sad part is that probably 4 days after it might have been that the Prime Minister of Dominica came in to visit us, and the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, and encouraged us and offered us aid and met with my Premier and gave us encouragement, only to understand that a week later, as Prime Minister from Dominica went back to his homeland, he was hit and personally hit with Hurricane Maria. And our sympathy went out to them as they were looking out for us. They too fell in the same boat. So my empathy to, I tried to call him, but I haven't gotten him yet, but I will reach him, my good Prime Minister, who really was there for us. So where do we go from here? Well, I tell people that, and one of the things I want to encourage us to do is whenever there's a disaster like this, one of the first things to do after is do everything possible. And it was raised this morning about how do we get the residents involved, but do everything possible to get our residents not to panic, but to find some way to quickly stabilize them. Now, I'm not going to mislead you and tell you that after a disaster like Irma, even I panicked. It took me perhaps 2 days to, as we say, gather myself. My job was to make sure the country was cleaned up, that the roads were open, that water was flowing, that electricity was back, and that the telecommunication was working. A big order for a Minister of Communications and Works. But it took me about 2 days to get my feet under me to see what we would do to get this thing going. And some of the help to get my feet under me were those meetings that we had right after the hurricane on a daily basis, sometimes twice a day. But do everything that you can to help your residents from panicking. And that is, as quickly as you can, get to them, get some communication with them. All of our communication was broken down, telephones, internet, all of the WhatsApp was gone, it was all gone. I don't know if it ever happened again, but I ended up taking my damaged, expensive Jeep, what is it again, a Range Rover. Had no windows, some windows, but not many windows. And I asked one of my workers to drive me around the whole town. He was able to provide me a little mic that had a speaker on it that I was able to go around for a couple of days, probably a week, every day, twice a day, telling people what was happening that came out of the meetings, what to do next, where to go for food. The bank is open. The ATM machines are going to be open today for 2 hours. Food is going to be available. Water is in abundance, don't worry. And all those things. It was important in those few first days to hear from someone in authority not to panic. But we have food, we have water. There's going to be tarpaulins, there's going to be different things helping. Those were important things in those early days because people were panicking. There's no doubt about it. There was looting, and unfortunately people break down their morality and did that. But in the first few hours after the storm, people panicked. Would there be food? Would there be water? My family owned a supermarket. We made a decision very early. We met with the other supermarket, the other two major supermarkets in the town. We said we have to open the stores regardless of whether people loot or not. Let's open. Let's get people some food and water. And we did that with some security help. And gradually people's fears and people's panic reduced and were able to get back to their normal lives over a few weeks. But this is an experience that you can't say what I said unless you were there. You can't do what we did after that storm unless you were there. You can plan all you want, talk all your planning, but until you were there, you can't plan it. But we went through that phase. We went through that stage. We came out of it relatively okay, except for some issues that we wish didn't happen. But now we have moved to the second phase, the recovery phase. And this is where Charlene and her team gradually handed it over to us as a cabinet with the coordinator to coordinate the recovery. And they have continued to work closely together to make sure the recovery is on the right track. And we want to thank them for that again because it's important that we as politicians who received information from them as the technocrats are able to hear them out, listen to their direction, and eventually agree to them and move forward on those instructions that we get from these good people. So the initial stage would be the response and the relief. Then we move to the short-term recovery that we are working on to make sure that the critical stages and agencies are up and running at those priorities, that operational shortfalls or the gaps are filled in there. And then we have to look at the longer-term plan of how we rebuild our communities, rebuilding homes, rebuilding businesses, rebuilding government institutions, rebuilding our infrastructure, critical to our survivability and our growth, electricity, water, sewage, the health sector. All of these critical stages we have to make sure that we get to and develop them. And we have clearly defined those priorities. These good folks have done so. They have presented them to us. They have clearly defined how our rebuilding will go, from the policies to the programs that we have to institute, to our housing plans that are crucial to the dignity and strength of our people, to health and social development, including the education of our children that is crucial to get back on track. And we have done so even in makeshift tents. The last tent we put up was one donated by one of the cruise ship companies, MSC, 4,000 square feet to house some children on the island of Virgin Gorda. And that reminds me to say thank you to all the private sector people all over the world, individuals, companies, businesses, governments throughout the Caribbean and throughout the world who came to our rescue very early and are continuing to come to our rescue, understanding that it's not all over for us. We need your help. I can't say it any more and clearly or any more distinctly. We were considered to be some rich nation somewhere in the world. But I don't know how many of you know the BVI. We are a country of tourism and financial services. In a way, it is skewed in terms of what is said by perhaps the United Nations or other countries, the European Union and so on, that we don't qualify for aid because we have a lot of rich lawyers and a lot of rich people who live there, probably 2,000 of the 28,000 population. But the rest of us sometimes struggle on a minimum wage of $6 an hour. It was $4 up to a year ago when we changed it. So there are a lot of people in the territory who are in that category where aid is needed. But as I tell people, I was in London meeting with the United Kingdom team with my premier this last week. As we tell them, whether it was so or not before, this is an unprecedented event that happened to us that we didn't ask for, that we wouldn't wish for again, but our country has been destroyed. Please help us. We need help. And help in terms of loans that we have to pay back in huge chunks is good help, but not the help we need immediately. We need our canoe to be pushed out into the water, and soon after, we can paddle our canoe by ourselves again. But we need help now. That's what we need. So in this stage and in this effort, we are trying to rebuild in a smarter way. We're trying to rebuild our country stronger. We are trying to rebuild our country in a greener way. It's an opportunity for that, in a sustainable and resilient way. I went to the United Kingdom and I told them we need $25 million to put back our poles and lines in the city and in the country. But we need another $25 million immediately after that to put it underground so the next hurricane comes, we won't have to put it on top of the ground again. Resilience. Do we need a round of applause for that? Hello. That's just one example that we put there. How can we build our houses better? How can we build our schools better? How can we build our houses and our schools greener? How can we do and look more into using our best asset all year round? Even in times of Irma, in the middle of a storm, when the sun came out, how can we use that sun and other aspects of renewable energy in the future to help to do our little part of reducing our part of the carbon print in the world today, our little part that we can do to reduce that without using fossil fuels. How many of us in the Caribbean are playing our little role while we ask the bigger countries to play their role in climate change? How many of us are prepared to make the sacrifices to seek climate change in the Caribbean so that the other nations who may not believe in it or who may one day come to understand it will do their part in addressing this important issue of climate change for the world and for our kids and our grandkids in the future. I want to encourage us as a Caribbean nation, as a Caribbean country, to think smart. Look at the resilience that we can do. There are great outcomes that we can have out of this. And I want to encourage us to look at those outcomes that we can get from recovery and a development plan that identifies these outcomes. And you will have a copy of these that you can look at and look closer. But I want to encourage us to understand that as governments, we must be ready to move on with a well-structured recovery plan and with a recovery plan that has our people in mind and involved as we move forward to build our country smarter, better, stronger, greener, and more resilient. I thank you.
Wow, that was a bit emotional for me. When you think you got it together, you walk around, the smile is on your face, and then you hear that again. It rips at you. A few years ago, I met a gentleman, very handsome man, Rick Morrell, and he told me something, and these weren't his exact words, but this is what I remember. He said, take care of your people. Take care of your staff, and make sure that they can trust you, and they will support you forever and ever. They trusted me. And when I made that call to move, they trusted that I was making the right decision. And I trusted the minister to be able to take us in and hold us together. So it's all about the trust. It does come down to that. So Mr. Morrell, I thank you for those words many years ago. The minister has pointed out a few very important things that we have to take into consideration when we talk about response going forward. And one is that the hurricane tracks have changed. They're no longer moving north of us. So our response has to be immediate. We have to act as soon as we're impacted. The experience that we've had over the past few months, the level of devastation is something that we have never, ever seen in the region. Even from a volcanic eruption, we have never seen this level of destruction. This is catastrophic. This record hurricane is off the tracks. And we need to absorb that, and we need to think about that, and we need to examine and think about what is to come. Is this going to be the norm? There was a plea for survival, and we acted in accordance with our plans. But the plan that I believe, and that Dr. Innes and Alex and Jermaine and Ronnie and everybody who's here representing the BVI would agree, the tsunami procedures that we practiced saved us. Because those tsunami procedures tell you to operate outside of your normal structures, operate as if you have nothing. That is what we depended on. The reality of the situation is raw. Those scars are going to last forever. Alex's scars will be there. It's been very difficult to deal with that, to see one of my own go down. But we're going to build back better, and we're going to build back stronger, and we're going to build back smarter, and we're going to build back greener, and we're going to build back better. So now I'm going to introduce the man who's going to help us to do that, Mr. Ronald Jackson, the Executive Director of the SEDEMA. And prior to his appointment at SEDEMA, Mr. Jackson served in the capacity of Director General of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica. That's when he didn't have much gray in his beard. He has been extensively involved in disaster management at the national, regional, and international levels in various capacities, as well as serving on various advisory committees. He holds a master's degree in natural resource management and environmental resource management, and a master's certificate in monitoring and evaluation and reporting. Who better to lead SEDEMA than Mr. Jackson?
Thank you, Charlene. And you know that I will definitely be there with you and the minister and the community in the BVI. And I'm sure all of your colleagues as well who are part of the SEDEMA family, who I speak on behalf of, some of our elderly statesmen like Fillmore Mullin and Brigadier General Arthurs and Frankie Michael, who, even though he's with another organization, will attest to that and certainly will be there. I'm going to be talking a little bit about 2 in 2. We were fortunate not to be dealing with the trio, even though certainly as we started off within the context of the response, this was certainly something that consumed our thoughts as to whether or not we would have been dealing with the trio of Irma, Jose, and Maria. And we were planning for that particular eventuality. Ladies and gentlemen, we haven't had a chance internally within SEDEMA to do our own after-action review. So, and I think it's important that as a team we have a chance to reflect on the regional response mechanism, not just as the internal SEDEMA CU, but also our partners, CARFA, and other CARICOM regional RSS, and a number of the other CARICOM partners, including our colleagues from the UN who would have supported, had a chance to really reflect on this. But my words, therefore, will provide just some reflections from the point of view of the executive director, from a particular vantage point. So do not take them as the final perspectives of the regional community in terms of thoughts on scaling up Furthermore, we have commissioned a comprehensive review of the regional response mechanism. And we want it to be very objectively done and to also benefit from the engagements that we would have had over the course of today. Next slide. As we talk about 2 in 2, it's important that we just set the context. And the context certainly is the SEDIMA mandate. The agency was created in 1991 as SEDERA. Much of the functions of SEDERA remains even in 2009 and after when we became SEDIMA. And I draw your attention specifically to the roles for SEDIMA, which speaks to mobilizing and coordinating relief, mitigating or eliminating the immediate consequences of disasters, secure and coordinate and provide reliable and comprehensive information on our states, encourage disaster loss reduction and cooperative mechanisms, coordinate the establishment and maintenance of adequate disaster response capabilities, and to provide immediate and coordinated response. I pointed this out because I think, by and large, there is a tendency for the wider community, and sometimes even within our community, within the Caribbean, and I'm talking about our Caribbean member states and the public, to not appreciate that back in the 1990s when the heads of government sat down recognizing the vulnerability of the region, that they were certainly forward-thinking in terms of creating an institution by Caribbean people, for the Caribbean people, leveraging the proximity and solidarity in support of its member states. We tend to forget that, and we tend to forget that we were at the cutting edge of these kinds of institutions to support small island developing states, and SEDIMA is the embodiment of that. We serve 18 governments. But there's a reason why I put this up there, because I'm going to try and be as frank as possible. I have my bosses here, some of them, so I still want to be serving and supporting at the end of it all. But it's important that we engage some of these things quite openly and honestly, because I think if we're going to be truly, as Charlene has said, moving forward and being better at this, we have to acknowledge where we have gaps. And this is the starting point. This is the context. This is what, as a community, we said we wanted an institution to do for us. This September really took the lid off of what we've been able to do in terms of our faithfulness in commitment to what it is that we've created. And so this has to be the starting point from which we look at this. Next slide, please. So you would have heard about these events, and this is just a track showing what we were dealing with, the number of SEDIMA member states that were in the path of these events. At some point when we were watching, we were looking at potentially 12 out of 18 states being impacted over the course of the events. And we're looking all the way across to Haiti and Jamaica, TCI and the Bahamas, as we looked longer term on our scenario planning. Eventually we were looking then at 9 states. And I think 9 states were impacted to some degree, varying degrees. I mean, we don't talk about Haiti. I think they were modest in even reflecting on their own situation. They had an impact from the outliers on the north, which caused floods. But even Haiti reflected a tremendous growth over Matthew in terms of how they themselves prepared and planned for the event that was to come. And even though I'm taking a regional view, it is important that we also reflect on the lessons that would have come out of the exercises that would have seen our member states improving in their own preparation. So it presented for us a multi-island scenario. And this morning, Mr. Collymore talked about the first experience back in, when was it, Jeremy, 1960-something? I don't remember, 1970s. I'm not trying to date you, but a long time. And as is always the situation, the 9-day wonder, we forget about those experiences. But this would have been, in modern times, the first multi-island impact scenario. When I say multi-island, I'm thinking more than 2 countries being affected. And that for SEDIMA would have, and the regional response mechanism, because the regional response mechanism, as you will see later, is more than just SEDIMA, presented significant challenges. We've become rehearsed in being deployed to deal with 1 or 2 states. We've become rehearsed to deal with 1 or 2 states with a span of a few months between. So we would have been drilled psychologically and in terms of the resource outlay to support the system, and this is coming from states, to really deal with that particular scenario. So we were facing something that was potentially a catastrophic scenario, which eventually ended up that way for member states. And I like to say that we were successful, and we have to recognize that, but there were gaps, and we held it together. I say to my team internally, and I'm quite comfortable in being honest to say to you, that we held it together with bubblegum and tape. We did, because we were asked to function well beyond what the capacity, not what it was designed to do, but what it was resourced to be able to do. And so we had to deliver. We had states that were depending on the regional architecture to support it. And we had to deliver. And commendations to my internal team and to also the external partners who jumped in, pitched in, deployed their own staff members who were not even trained to be deployed into the theater of operations to really ensure that we could deliver something. And that is really a testament to the caliber and the psyche of the Caribbean community in terms of fulfilling that solidarity. And I think we should hear a round of applause for our colleagues. So we deployed 500 plus operational personnel, and that didn't include all of the sort of military assets that were in theater. 500 for a system that was essentially designed to deploy 2 to 3 teams of each kind. We have the operational support team, we have search and rescue teams, we have the CDRU, this is the CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit, and we have RNATs, and we have the CDAC, the damage assessment teams. Resource-wise, we've never been able to build it out beyond 2 to 3. But we exceeded that in this particular operation. The pre-event analysis and the impact scenarios that we were working with at SEDEMA, some of which is tools we were testing, but also manual work done by Brigadier General Arthurs and Joan Prasad and Mandela Christian, pulling statistical data from off the web from our member states, revealed to us that we were looking at potentially 100% impact on several of our states. And this was certainly realized in the case of Dominica, in the case of Barbuda, and in the case of TCI and BVI, you would have heard between 75% and 100% of impact on the population. And once you can't move, once you can't access resources, you are within that group of impacted. Next slide, please. So the way SEDEMA addresses these situations is through a tool we call the Regional Response Mechanism. It was designed in the 1990s, and so certainly, as I've said before, some of the assumptions that would have informed its development are perhaps no longer holding. Hence, we're looking at it. It is based on a set of principles: sovereignty, so we respect the sovereignty of our member states. We work for them, as I said before. Solidarity, the mandate, as I would have shown before, we work within the context of and ascribe to the international humanitarian principles. And we are very much a supporter of partnerships. So we're celebrating partnerships as one of the themes for the conference this year, but that is how we work and try to deliver on the results of the RM. Partnerships with private sector, partnerships with our member institutions and sister institutions, and partnerships with our communities. There are concepts which drives it, but also regional realities which we have to accept and work within that context. And some of it certainly played its part when we were to zoom in on Dominica, zoom in on Antigua and Barbuda, on Bahamas, multi-island scenarios where the center would have its own challenge in being able to respond to and identify the needs of the outlying islands. So we had everything at play in this particular scenario, simply because of the regional realities we face in terms of the islands, how they're placed, and the waters between them, and the challenges to get to them in normal times. Political reluctance in terms of unwillingness or willingness of countries to declare national disasters, among other political challenges which define how our political actors, leaders, will seek to operate, are part of what we have to look at when we're operating the RRM. Access to transport and the potential of regional security apparatuses which exists. And you would have heard the Prime Minister talk about the Bahamas vessels which reported, Jamaica which went in, Belize, Trinidad, etc., and what they're capable of doing. Next slide. So the RRM, next slide please. The RRM is really made up of a set of national disaster plans, national disaster plans, regional coordination plans, specialized plans, the donor group mechanism. In the past we used to call them the Eastern Caribbean Donor Group, and we tried to establish the Western Caribbean Donor Group. We've been rehearsing what we call a regional coordination mechanism for all donors to be able to, in the same space virtually as well as physically, partner on these discussions around how we support sub-regional warehouses, sub-regional focal points, a series of MOUs, standard operating procedures, agreements, etc., and specialized teams. This would have been the backbone of the existing regional response mechanism. Next slide. Why am I showing you this? It's important. Many people do not know that this exists or how it operates. We have some booklets which I'm sure Clive and Mandela and General will be giving out to you, so you get a full sense of what are the principles that drive it and how it works, what it's made up of, before we get into the revision. What we've also done is to establish sub-regional focal points or sub-regional coordination hubs. This was also tested in this particular operations. The assumptions that underpinned how we created these sub-regional divisions and the role that they would play for the regional response mechanism in the operational space was also on show. Some went according to script, others came a little bit off script by virtue of changing processes that we have no control over, but which would now have changed a little bit of how we thought it would function. Next slide. So the RM is really based on some key considerations that we must have the capacity to mobilize and dispatch and coordinate regional disaster response support to all our affected states. That's what underpins the RM. So we see it, we read it, but when it comes to effectively operationalize it, again, we recognize that we haven't really fulfilled what we expect and what our member states expect. And I must be frank, it's the fault of our member states. It is the fault of our member states, and we have to appreciate that. It must have the capacity to coordinate international disaster relief requirements for the participating states. So yes, in a scenario such as this, where the international community will look across and perhaps at the behest of the RC, will come in to support the RC, the resident coordinator of the UN, who himself is attached to certain charters from the UN and its relationship with member states. How do we facilitate the coordination mechanism of the external actors that come in? This was also part of the role for SEDEMA. Next. The triggering mechanism. We currently have a 3-tier triggering mechanism where tier 1 is just a notification. And we had countries that experienced that, such as St. Kitts, Montserrat, who notified SEDEMA that they were impacted but did not require the regional response mechanism to support them. A level 2, where there is some impact, but it is something that the countries believe they can handle on their own but require specific and specialized support. And a level 3, where they require the whole kit and caboodle of the regional response mechanism, all the teams that are there. And this is supposed to be integrated into their national plans and triggered and defined as such. Next slide. And then this is the philosophy which drives the regional response. I'm sharing all of this because, oftentimes we don't recognize that there is certainly an existing architecture that was designed with the sort of philosophy, with the sort of guidelines, with the tenets that will help it function. But what did we find out? Next slide. We did this exercise back in 2013 when we tried to get a sense of which one of our member states, one or ones of our member states, should really trigger a national disaster, which would necessitate a regional response, which one would trigger a regional level disaster, which would require international assets coming in. This is theoretical. And if you look at it, it really points to the fact that if we look at ourselves as a region, I'm going back to the whole understanding of the regional integration movement and the role of CARICOM and its instruments, SEDIMA being one of them, to pull together and pool all of the region's resources and capacity. In theory, Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, potentially Barbados, should have been the countries that would trigger the kind of scaled up events that would see the full rollout of the RM and potentially the international response. But what have we learned? We've been looking at the CDM reporting, and there's one that deals with preparedness for response and legislation, and it tells us that we've not yet invested in the system where countries with populations the size of 20 and 40 have so driven down vulnerability and exposure in the region and put in the kind of national level investment in the national architecture so that they can function. And Minister, I'm not putting you on the spot because I feel very passionate about this, because Director Dabrio has for a long time been making the point that they needed a resilient operational facility. And that is just illustrative of why we see countries at a particular population size triggering the kind of international or regional to international scale response, which if we thought about it in a region of what, over 5 million, if you take Haiti out of it, 5 million people, am I correct, somewhere there? 6 million people. We should be able to respond collectively to 20,000 people, to 1,600 people. In fact, SEDIMA shouldn't need be triggered to respond to Barbuda, because that should be, in theory, something Antigua should be able to fully tackle and handle. And I think Fillmore tried to be true to that philosophy, because he didn't. He said he looked around and he said, but there's BVI and there's Dominica. He's going to manage his situation on his own because he saw where there were greater needs for the regional resources than in his own shop. And that comes again from someone who understands the system, even though not necessarily the resources may not have been there to really support his view. So quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but when we look at, next slide, when we look at the effectiveness of the regional response, what are some of the immediate things that came forward? Next slide, please. Possibly review, what we saw, the need to possibly review the triggering mechanism or develop pre-deployment arrangements. Question is, how can we get there faster and with the kind of resources that will help our member states when assets to move across the ocean may be challenged? Do we need to look at the trigger? Do we need to look at new arrangements with our member states for pre-deployment, recognizing the issue of sovereignty and that SEDIMA is not responding to take over a national response? It is called a regional response support mechanism. SEDIMA is going in to support the national operations, to be embedded and to be at the behest of the head of the national response. The IDA-DANA continuum, as it goes into the PDNA, needs to be looked at. One, it needs to be rapidly speed up to inform the kind of support that is going to come externally, but it has to be done in such a way that there's connectivity right through the thread to inform the recovery priorities. Maximizing reach. I scored us negatively there, simply because we still struggle with the availability of the appropriate and dedicated transportation to be able to get into our member countries quickly and into spaces that may, in the best of times, be challenging to access. The need to manage the tendency for non-operational actors to function outside of their role and responsibility. And we saw this coming through, even within the Caribbean community, where we had a number of hubs emerging to try to coordinate an event where CARICOM had already set up an institution to be able to do that. So we have to, as a region, we ourselves have to go back to this recommitment to what we've set up and not to undermine the ability. We talk about wanting to coordinate, but even by our very actions, we were defeating what was coming out of our mouth about coordination. So we saw some of that coming through. Better coordination of bilateral arrangements. What do I mean? Again, our states are sovereign. And so prime minister to prime minister, colleagues, they will speak. And SEDIMA has no challenge with that, but to facilitate that. But it's difficult to facilitate where we are not aware of the bilateral arrangements, and requests are made at that time which we are not aware of, and it makes it a challenge for us to look at. Next slide. Predictability and flexibility. There's certainly room for much improvement here at all levels through better financing, planning, and information exchange. Timeliness. It was positive. Our teams, even when they were not yet trained, but who stood up institution by institution, volunteer by volunteer, offering to go. They were ready. In the case of BVI, we got as far as Antigua within hours after the event. We were supported by some of our development partners to be able to access transportation to get across. But they were stranded there for 2 days. Why? A mix of the private sector hiring every single helicopter you could find in the space to facilitate the private sector response. So even though we were asking for helicopters, we could not get one helicopter to be able to deploy to our response, to be able to get over to BVI quickly. And then a mix of people withdrawing their assets because they were keeping an eye on Jose. So our team had to hunker down in Antigua and support Fillmore as best as they can. So that's something that we have to work on it. We moved quickly. We were the first to fly and to collect images of Dominica immediately after the event. That was able to allow us to better pinpoint where the damage was more significant. And we had the benefit of having a Caribbean community where we had past Dominican staff and current Dominican staff who was able to, frame by frame, over 12 to 24 hours, slow down that footage and give us intelligence on where we thought the worst affected areas were and where we saw the challenges emerging, which I think is a positive, it's a plus, and it speaks to finding a way, even when there is challenge, and testament to the RSS, the Regional Security Systems, one of our partners. When we made a request for aircraft to fly over, we couldn't get it. Colleague to colleague, we said, let's use the security cameras you have, and let's send Miss Donna Pierre, who is no longer with us, there on that treacherous flight. She can tell you the stories of having to travel with her barf bag, flying into the immediate aftermath of the storm to get eyes on the territory. Coordination, emerging but needs improvement. Partnership, emerging but requires trust and commitment. Trust and commitment. We had strong partnership with the private sector, strong partnerships with the UN system this time around, but there is still room for greater trust and commitment. And Jenny can tell you, Jenny, you can stand up. Jenny was a very good bridge between SEDIMA and the UN community in terms of beginning to build the trust between the two responding arms so we can work together. I always say to my UN colleagues, both of us have an agreement with our governments. So we're striving for the same things. What we need to do is to be more efficient and effective in how we coordinate our own resources to be in support of the states, not to be tripping over each other, trying to one-up each other. And we saw the emergence of a partnership, which we have to work on. We have a lot more work to do there. We have learning systems. And you're going to hear from the next session. I won't touch on that a little bit, but one of the things SEDIMA is doing now with the response is we are trying to hear from the community who is affected. It's not about whether we thought we did well. It's to hear, and there should be no fear in whether they say we didn't do well. Because what we're trying to do is to find out where the gaps are and where we need to target investments to continue to raise the bar and to improve, to support our member states. And some of the lessons are for us, some are for the states, some are for the wider community. More work needs to be done on enhancing national systems so as to maximize potential. What do I mean? The RRM, the Regional Response Mechanism, is built from the ground up. It is predicated on having strong national disaster management mechanisms. So if we deploy the RRM into a country that is affected, and there are states with very weak infrastructure, it cannot be as effectively utilized. And so we believe that the investment has to start at the state level. It has to start there and build up so we have a strong regional system. And as I get to my final slides, scaling up, I'm very mindful of the time. Forgive me, I've been doing a lot of presentation and I kind of slept over this as I put it together. Scaling up and enhancing the RRM, the way forward. We have to look also at this corporate volunteer program and how we establish that to be able to better utilize the corporate capabilities within the region to spell the staff that works in the regional coordination center and also some of our field teams. You know, we have the tendency for operational fatigue when we see these multi-island, hours, days types of events. SEDIMA's RRM is currently limited to 21 days in the field. We went well beyond that. In fact, we're just coming out of Dominica, and you know, BVA has asked us for one specific product to assist them. So you know, we're seeing where we're stretched beyond what the mandate speaks to. We have to look at that. Greater leveraging of the regional and national capacities within the RRM. I spoke to that in terms of the number of people across the region with skills and how we use that. Pre-impact data sets. We need to invest in that, and it provides us greater intelligence of the impacted countries, especially information on the vulnerabilities within the region. We have to revisit the assumptions that defined the establishment of the sub-regional disaster operational units, such as logistics, warehousing, relief, better transition of sub-regional leadership, where one country was supposed to lead is affected. How do we pass the sub-regional leadership? Where there may be 3 countries in a sub-region that is affected, how do we properly pass the leadership onto a non-sub-regional entity? That has to be looked at. Revisit the rules of engagement of the regional with the international interface. You know, we have to do that, and we have some commitment already from our UN colleagues on how we're going to do that going forward. We'll require revisiting the mechanisms for sustainable financing the regional response mechanism to ensure that there's greater predictability and support. And of course, additional roles for dealing with non-resident displacement. We saw where a number of member states were asking for support to evacuate, to identify first their residents in the countries that were affected and to evacuate them. It's a new role that has never come forward before, and it requires careful thought. We can learn from our Canadian colleagues in terms of the composition of their CDAT team, where they have people with skills in diplomacy and other things deployed as part of their teams. Next. So what are we striving for? We're striving to achieve this sort of enhanced regional coordination model. The threat of climate change presents for the regional SIDS. The threat that climate change presents for the regional SIDS is reflected in more frequent and severe humanitarian consequences. We've heard that. Right? Until we deal with vulnerability and exposure, which is not going to happen overnight, and the climate is not going to heal overnight, we're going to have more humanitarian consequences, which is going to necessitate response capabilities nationally and regionally. So I believe that even though it pains me, I have to change our jargon a little bit to say that operational readiness and response is a climate change adaptation solution. And so we have to look at how we can pull through those climate change resources into supporting. Next slide, my final slide. This is just an initial thought in 2013 when we were brainstorming where we need to go as a region. And we're hoping to bring some resources behind this around some of the areas of investments we have to look at as we continue to look at strengthening the regional response mechanism and truly realizing what is spelled out in the mandate, the vision that was articulated back in 1991 as backed up by the experiences in September 2017. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, did I fail miserably at keeping time? But I think it was important for us to hear that session. I think this is really what this conference is about, to us really understand what took place, what worked, what didn't work, where we need support. And just like how the minister pleaded for help for BVI, and I'm going to plead again, we need help. Get rid of the GDP nonsense. We got hit and our estimates are 3.5 times our GDP. So I don't want to hear any measurement about GDP anymore. We have people who are truly suffering, people who need to have roofs over their heads. This is what we're about. This is why SEDIMA was created. This is why we have national disaster offices. This is why we're having all this discussion about partnership. We need help, but SEDIMA needs help too. And we need to have that mechanism, the response aspect of that mechanism strengthened much more than where it is now. Because if we are to fit, let's take climate change and push it aside, and let's think about if we do get hit by one of these major earthquakes. I know, Ivan, don't preach it because it happens when I say it. But we really have to think about all the hazards that we're faced with and how we will deal with them if we had multiple events, multiple hazards impacting on this region. One of the things I heard very early coming out from our Premier's office was, where's Stephen? Where's Stephen? We need to get Stephen on the ground. Stephen will help us. Oh, yeah, let's get Stephen. So, Stephen, we're going to call you up to help us now. Stephen O'Malley, the UN resident coordinator and UNDP resident representative for Barbados and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. He assumed his post in August of 2013. Before his assignment, he spent 12 years at OCHA in the UN Secretariat in New York. His last post was as Deputy Director, Coordination and Response Division. And then from 2008 to 2013, he was Chief of Central Emergency Response Fund Secretariat. He served in a variety of roles in OCHA related to Southern and Eastern Africa. And prior to joining OCHA, Stephen spent 7 years with the non-governmental organization Médecins des Français in North America. Did I say that correctly, Madame? I hope so. Europe and Africa. Stephen, I see why you're such an important man. So please join me at the podium.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Charlene, and thank you to everybody for this opportunity to speak. It is a real honor for me to be here with this distinguished group and to provide a commentary from the perspective of the United Nations, my colleagues in the UN sub-regional team for Barbados and the OECS, but also the non-resident agencies such as the World Food Program and the International Organization for Migration, who were very closely involved in the response to Irma and Maria. In my speech today, I do want to offer some reflections from my perspective and from the perspective of my colleagues on the things that worked during that immediate response and in the concurrent early recovery activities, because really we have to see the two things as running side by side and what can be improved. My reflections are very much based on that last 4 months of co-chairing the Eastern Caribbean Development Partners Group with Ron, and also my experiences over the last 4 years and some of my previous experiences. I am very much benefiting from the excellent presentations that have already occurred. I was really take special note of the lessons learned that were presented by P.S. Gloria Joseph of Dominica. I was joking with her that you can all thank her for shortening my presentation. I'd really like to begin by fully subscribing to the view of the context that PM Minnis gave us this morning. My working assumption is that we will see an increased number of stronger storms in the years to come, and we have to be prepared for that scenario. For the UN in particular, that requires us to think very carefully about our role in support of national and regional action. I also want to say at the outset, recognize the incredible resilience of the people of the affected islands and the remarkable solidarity of the Caribbean people. Across the affected islands, people whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed picked themselves up and started to rebuild and assisted their neighbors to do so. Individual citizens, civil society organizations, church groups, etc., mobilized those to assist those in need in neighboring islands. And I want to particularly recognize those people in the room who have worked tirelessly since early September to respond to impacts in their own islands or in neighboring islands. So how did we do, the professionals, those of us in this room, and what can we do better next time? We will get the initial insights from Jeremy Collymore and the After Action Review later today, hopefully this afternoon and not tonight, but we'll see how we do. But from previous discussions, I think what I'm going to say is largely in line with their preliminary results. The UN's response to Irma and Maria was on a scale not seen since Hurricane Ivan in 2004. And thus it reflects the changes in the humanitarian situation in the system from the several rounds of reform that have occurred since then. In support of national efforts and those of SEDIMA, United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination teams deployed together with SEDIMA Rapid Needs Assessment teams in Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, BVI, and Dominica. UN agencies surged staff from across the region and around the world and advanced several $1 million in internal grant and loan financing while donor support was being mobilized. The Central Emergency Response Fund, again something that didn't exist at the time of Ivan, released $5 million to these agencies, and for the first time in the English-speaking Caribbean, the World Food Program established a United Nations humanitarian air service, which carried more than 800 passengers and 10 tons of cargo in less than 2 months. And at the moment, WFP and UNICEF are jointly implementing a cash transfer program for 25,000 people in Dominica, another innovation from the past practice of food and commodity distribution. Here I would also want to take note of the efforts of the IFRC. So again, we're seeing this transition, as we've seen in other parts of the world, away from commodity distribution and into cash distributions. Frankly, giving people cash is the single most effective way of getting economies moving again, and it gives them much more control over their own choices. And in another first, and thanks to Ron Jackson's generosity and vision as well, OCHA coordination and information management staff and WFP logistics and information staff were embedded into the SEDIMA coordination unit in Barbados. We think this arrangement turned out to be very beneficial. Certainly it was for us, and we think it was for SEDIMA as well, and we hope it will be repeated. From the side of the UN, we are still sifting through these lessons we've learned and are still learning from the experience, still have people on the ground in BVI, in Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica. But it is clear that we need to pick up our dialogue with SEDIMA and determine how best we can plug into the regional response mechanism and how to achieve interoperability. We have recognized we need to understand better how the different components of the RRM work, and we need to think about the best ways to work with the national emergency managers and national structures. Our added value needs to be clearly established for SEDIMA, the RRM, and national actors so that they can determine what parts can be most useful for them. So let me turn to a few comments on Irma, the response to Irma and Maria. I mean, I think the response, the strengths of our response are fairly evident. The national mobilization, as was described in the last session, the speed of deployment of the SEDIMA teams and other elements of the RRM, a rapid response from the international actors, and strong and consistent engagement from national leaders, regional actors, and international partners, as evidenced most recently at the CARICOM high-level conference in New York. As Ron said when he opened up, we need to recognize our successes. Nonetheless, in thinking about our response, I want to echo some of the other comments that were made today. I really do believe it's a time to have a fundamental reconsideration of the way we do business. Little of what I'm going to say then is new, but I hope the shock of the experience will propel us into action. A wake-up call, as Fillmore called it this morning. Let me focus on 4 areas to illustrate. I had a longer list, but as I said, P.S. Joseph helped me trim it down. One, we need to invest in strengthening the National Disaster Management Offices. Many of the National Disaster Management Offices are too small and under-resourced for the task. That's not to take anything away from any of the professionals, the excellent professionals in many of those offices. It's simply to say that there are not enough of them to manage the overwhelming need for coordination and information in a major crisis. And the planning documents that they've developed, the crisis plans that they've developed, are often unknown to many participants. So if we want to optimize the response, then we have to capacitate the people who are steering the response. Number 2, the members of our National Emergency Operations Centers need to exercise together and have clear TORs and leadership. They're too often composed of people who have not had the opportunity to train together or exercise together, may not have up-to-date TORs, and do not have clear decision-making authority. And unlike what Captain Russell described for Bahamas, they do not always have established mechanisms to co-opt and plug in the international actors, whether from the UN, inter-regional militaries, or international NGOs. And I really want to stress this. Make no mistake, the international actors would prefer to be inside the tent rather than outside. As a related point, we also need to be able to stand up sectoral coordination and intersectoral coordination more quickly. In many situations, from what I've seen, the health sector is really the only experience with a coordinated plan and a coordinated response in the early days of the response. Number 3, we need new assessment and information management tools and practices. Let me start with the rapid needs assessment teams, where we were very happy to be part of those. I think CDEMA does a fantastic job of assembling the RNATs at the country's requests and deploying them. But do the people who are deployed have the same understanding of their tasks? Have the assessment tools and formats been updated to reflect international best practice? And finally, and this is a particular point of mine, the results from those initial assessments simply take too long to come out, to be useful. Of the 3 RNATs requested after Irma and Maria, as of today, only 1 country has formally released its results. Big shout out to Charlene for getting that done, and to Minister, I'm sure you were part of that decision as well. So here's my question. If the assessment reports are not being issued, how do we know they're being used? And if we're not sure about that, why are we doing them? So what do we need to convince the political directorate to get this information out? Because I think we all know what happens and where the information goes and where it stays. I'd like to suggest that the region considers adopting either whole or in part the multi-sector, multi-cluster initial rapid assessment approach, which has been approved for global use by the Interagency Standing Committee. This implies producing an initial situation analysis based on secondary data and initial primary data within 3 days of the event. From what I've seen, CDEMA has done excellent analysis of the 2011 census data from across the region and has used it to shape its initial assessments of the situation. Certainly there's possibility to include more secondary data in that as well, but we really are not very far from having the capacity to do that right now. Also under the MIRA, The initial assessments are followed by joint data collection exercise over the next couple of weeks. It doesn't mean that the relief operations have to wait 2 weeks to start, but that the response will be adjusted as the results come in. Certainly speaking from my position of UN resident coordinator and the expectations that are put upon me, I need this assessment data to inform any requests I'm going to make for SURF funding. And the expectation is that I should be able to give a rough idea of what's the envelope I'm looking for and what I think the overall response is going to cost within three or 4 days of the event. So from a UN perspective, our preference is to be feeding those initial results, the initial results from the initial damage assessments from the RNet teams, directly into those SURF requests rather than relying on parallel assessments. And I know from talking to the development partners, our development partners, that they face the same pressures and expectations from their headquarters wherever they are. How do we keep the world informed of our progress in the response and the assistance we want to provide and accelerate the recovery process? Now, generally, this has taken the form of our situation reporting. And I went back and I looked at the situation reports from both Irma and Maria. In the case of Dominica and Maria, really there is a lot of useful information that has been collated from different actors. So-and-so is doing this, so-and-so is doing that. And the analysis continued to deepen with each succeeding edition. And the use of maps and graphics also deepened and deepened. In some ways, the IRMA-CIT reps suffered because of the number of countries that were involved. It was harder to pull out a situation for an analysis for the affected countries, as well as a sense of how their needs were changing. Again, we have long lists of activities by different actors, and we all know that visibility is important for people. I've certainly suffered when somebody's inputs weren't included in a document. But at the end of the day, it was hard for me to look at those reports on the IRMA side and say, well, what's the purpose of this document? Is it to give an accounting of what each of us is doing? What is the purpose of it? And we know that a lot of people are spending a great deal of time putting those documents together. So I'd like to suggest that we think about the purpose of those documents, determine what form and content we want to have, and then focus on a sort of reinvented product. I think that would help us all a lot and probably utilize our time in a better way. And I also think this is particularly important given the rise of social media. If you look at the extensive use of social media by Prime Minister Skerritt in particular in Dominica, you will see how much the world has changed and the way communications works and how we collectively need to change with it in the way that we share information. And finally, we need the right legislative frameworks in place. As previous presenters have said, there is work going on in this regard, but we need to accelerate it. Too many contingency plans are out of date or were never finalized. We need to mainstream the disaster risk reduction into sectoral and national policies and ensure that political commitment for them is there. Although some sectors are obviously more affected than others, recent events have shown us that all sectors need to develop or continue to develop an effective approach to reducing disaster risk. So there's a lot that we can do. Some of the potential solutions are going to be easier than others, some are technical, and some, frankly, require us to think very carefully about how to overcome political challenges and political problems. And that's why we need ministers and others to champion and pull forward some of those with colleagues who may have concerns about what information they should put out and how that information might reflect on their country. I think we need to think that through. As I said at the beginning of my speech, my remarks are based on some of my experiences. And when I was in New York, working for OCHA during those 12 years, I went through two major reforms. The first in 2005, after the failures, and I'm going to use that word, the failures in Darfur, and the second in 2011 and onwards, after the unsatisfactory response to the Haiti earthquake and the floods in Pakistan. In this case, at this time, the region has not failed. The region has responded well. But I think we can all agree that we've seen what the future looks like, and business as usual is not going to be enough. And I'll close with a quote from Will Rogers, who's an American humorist from the 1930s. Even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. So thank you all very much.
Need a whole history lesson on that session alone. That's some very powerful statements there that have just been made, and I'll wrap those up at the end. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Kimberly Coleman, who is the Director of International Affairs Division of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Coleman is responsible for shaping FEMA's international engagements and strengthening international mutual cooperation with national and regional emergency management and civil protection authorities. FEMA's international activities include bilateral and multilateral capacity building activities, leading U.S.-NATO civil emergency preparedness with permanent staff at the UN-NATO mission, and leading international assistance to the U.S. during domestic disasters. She joined FEMA in May of 2017, following tenures with the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Defense. So please, let's welcome her to the podium.
So thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. I know we're running over schedule, so I'll try to be brief. So I wanted to say thank you to honorable guests and colleagues here. It's my pleasure to be here. It's quite an interesting event, and I have learned quite a bit throughout the day. Second, I want to send regrets from Administrator Long of FEMA. He is busy with, along with his leadership team, still leading our recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Texas, and Florida. So as you can imagine, we are pretty much 90% still dedicated at headquarters, the regional and the local levels for the recovery operations. Third, let me send a thank you to all the emergency management authorities that are here today, all the support, the email even from Mr. Jackson during all of our response and recovery efforts. It meant a lot to just get those kind gestures of solidarity, thinking about you. It's tough. We all were going through the same thing at the same time across unprecedented. We use that word too much these days, but the scale is something we couldn't have envisioned before now. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about, I had a timeline. Are you going to be able to pull it up? The hurricane, okay, it's okay if you don't have it. I was just going to give you a little bit of a perspective from the U.S. and all that we were dealing with in terms of the scope and the scale. Most of has already been covered in terms of not enough resources, not enough people, not enough time, and we were just overwhelmed with the scope and the scale. So I'll go a little bit about what we've learned so far, knowing that we are just in the very early days. As I said, 90% of our staff and time are focused on the recovery operations. So from August 25th until just a few weeks ago, we were at 24-hour operations, 7 days a week at headquarters, at the regions, and at the local level. So we had we had staff dedicated across all the disasters as well as at headquarters. We were responding to the needs of over 25 million affected citizens. We were covering over 270,000 square miles. And in addition to the hurricanes, we were dealing with wildfires and other disasters. So we were from Hurricane Harvey, which was a slow-moving disaster, to the unprecedented speed and scale of Irma and Maria, as discussed. We were dealing with deploying staff and resources. We were dealing with the same thing in terms of communications, interoperability, having more demand than we could possibly supply. So we had to make difficult decisions. And some of the themes that we're starting to wrestle with, again, as Mr. Jackson talked about and others, we are at the very early stages of what we call after action and lesson learned processes. We probably won't have a formal report out for months to come, but some of the themes that I can share with you today is we talk a lot about continuity of government. How do we meet the needs of our citizens? How do we return to normal order while we have the emergency management staff, which in our case also very much included the federal and state level military, Coast Guard and others, as part of the response? How do we meet the needs of citizens in one disaster site at the same time quickly turning to the next disaster? It's a challenge, and so we had to constantly make those very difficult decisions, and they were imperfect at best, but we were doing our best to communicate and be responsive in real time. Constantly having to make tough choices and then communicate the decisions and maintain expectations. It's been said well before on this panel about being honest with citizens and saying this is what we can do, this is what we will do, and certainly you have to then do it. And if you can't, you should also communicate that as well. The challenges for transportation and logistics cannot be overstated. The fact that we talk about Puerto Rico in particular, getting into a port that's no longer there makes it very difficult, and if you can't get into the port, you can't then deliver the personnel and you can't deliver the commodities. So that is something that's very difficult to communicate, and it's very difficult to explain, and it's even more frustrating when you have the will and you have the commitment, but the getting it done is a lot harder than you can possibly ever communicate to the citizens, and so it makes it it's a very tough time, but that is where we've been, and I know that we're all like-minded here, and I've all lived through it. Staffing, we is large, yes, and I think, oh, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of resources, and we were still overmatched, full stop. So we have a lot of dedicated people. We have staff that have been deployed to one or more disasters on average 90 days. So we talked about kind of what you typically have, somewhere 30, 45 days is the typical deployment, and then you come home and you reset, and then if you have to go back out, so be it. And we've had to turn all that in real time, turn those policies around, and have had staff that have given up a great deal, and we're all grateful for it because we can't do it without the staff. And so the challenges to staffing alone, again, cannot be overstated. It has been quite something to try to behold in terms of what it means. And so you have individuals who've been out in the field since September, and we bring them home and they reset, but they go back out. And so you've had people go from Texas to Florida or to Puerto Rico. Some people have gone just to Puerto Rico and they're just stationed there. So it's quite a challenge to think about the mass of what we're dealing with. And again, it's the same theme, so I don't need to kind of go into the themes. They're all quite the same. It's just the scale and the scope and the disaster site, so to speak. And then being able to sustain the logistics operations. So if you think about military, they have primacy in terms of what their core responsibility and mandate is to, in terms of military and protecting us and serving overseas, and yet they've been paramount to this response effort. And so they have the draw on our military, our Coast Guard, our National Guard, our emergency management. We've had the foresight at the federal level to have what we call a surge capacity, where we can pull across other federal departments and have their staff deploy. But it's been quite a task, and so now we're going through that whole process of what this looks like in the future, and that's part of what's been able to sustain having these extremely long deployments over extended geography, and so having the federal partners involved. The private sector has been instrumental, and certainly the voluntary organizations. Sheltering and housing survivors, and so I think that's something for us has been it's been a challenge that we have never had to deal with on this scale. So we have the sheltering and housing challenges in Texas and Florida, and those are things that we're used to, and we've seen them before, but more and what we're dealing with in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands is something that's quite altogether different. But Puerto Rico, in terms of just the scale of the scope and the terrain, and not being able to quickly set up temporary housing. And so dealing with that, and what does it look like? How do we approach sheltering and temporary housing from a very different perspective? So we are in real time looking at innovations, looking at other federal partners, how they deal with these issues, and certainly reaching into the international community for lessons learned and best practices. I would say some other points I would share with you is in terms of just the amount of resources, just so you can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the percentage of our overall population. So when I say 26 million people were affected, that's 8% of our overall national population. So that's something we're just not used to dealing with at one time in such a short period of time. To date, we have approved and administered about $2 billion in individual assistance. It's separate from the infrastructure, that's separate from, the actual response. It's actually getting money to individuals to rebuild their lives or just to sustain for 30 to 90 days. We've had to have staffing at our operations center, and that's its own dedicated resources. This was the largest air mission in FEMA's history, largest commodity mission in our history, over 32 million liters of water and 26 million meals, 423 generators installed thus far. And in terms of our medical response, over 4,700 medical personnel and over 32,000 patients cared for. And still, it's still not enough, and so we're well aware of that. I would take this minute to also want to acknowledge all the support we receive from the international community. And most people don't think of the United States international community. How does that all fit together? Well, we have our neighbors to the north and the south, Canada and Mexico, were very helpful. And Mexico was also dealing with its own natural disasters at the same time, 3 major earthquakes. We used our team to Mexico for their second major earthquake, and New Mexico actually provided assistance to us in Puerto Rico. So those MOUs ahead of time, exercising together, interoperability, make a difference in real time when you need your neighbors. We had offers of assistance from as far as New Zealand for meeting our feeding requirements in Puerto Rico. So we are very grateful for the international community's support, not just the notes of solidarity, but actually committing resources oftentimes, as I've said, in the middle of dealing with our own emergency responses, natural disasters or otherwise. So to that, I just want to end with a thank you and acknowledge that we're all dealing with a shared risk and a shared responsibility, and that we think we can continue to work toward together if we have this spirit of it's in our best interest and our citizens expect as much of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coleman. I just want to wrap up this session by just highlighting a few things that came out of the last phase following Mr. Jackson's presentation. So one of the things that we've seen and that we've heard is that our regional response partners were the first to be on the ground. They established a good connection with the people, but there was also the challenges that are being placed on our international partners as well, like Dr. Coleman mentioned, the overwhelming need for resources, for human resources. What we saw that worked extremely well in BVI is that you had some highly technical teams that came in, and I will single out PAHO here. They had their officials on the ground very early. The assessments were done early. The reports were prepared early. So we had a true picture of what the health sector needs were. And they continued to leave someone on the ground to follow up and to work with the countries. And I think that's very important when you're at this level of catastrophe. There was lots of discussion on the changes that are needed in the regional response approach. The 21-day time frame doesn't work well for these catastrophic type events. I was on the phone with Ronald and Liz on many occasions. Please leave them. We need them another week. You can't take them out now. Now that we're just making that connection with the community, we're now getting things moving. It was not the right time to pull them out. So we need to adjust our regional response plans. Dr. Coleman kept emphasizing about the need to have additional staff. I mean, where do we find them? Are we going to train extra volunteers? Are we going to pull out the technical teams from the universities? Or we have to find a way to backstop that. There was also the issue of transportation, and I was speaking with Rick Morrell before the session started, and Tropical alone had 91 calls in 1 month. I mean, that's amazing just for one organization, but we depend so much on tropical shipping. So we have to look at the extent of the transportation needs that we have as a region, and when we have the complications of ports in Antigua and ports in San Juan being affected, it really complicates things. But I want to recognize the tremendous efforts and the contributions made by Tropical Shipping. Thank you very much for that. One of the other key points that came out was the whole issue of the initial impact assessment, and in the BVI, we utilized the drones that were available, and that really was able to pull a lot of the imaging to us. We also supported that with the national GIS system. I tell you, the power of GIS. If you haven't used it yet, get it. Pay the money. Subscribe. It's the best thing ever created. I mean, we were able to get our impact report even within a month, and all the baseline was coming from the national GIS system. When you have that system in place, it's really, really helpful. We have to develop our begging skills. We have to beg more. We got to plead more. I don't think we've mastered that skill enough. And then we have to tell our stories. We have to tell the stories through these conferences, through social media, as Stephen mentioned, through video. We need to tell the world what happened, keep people informed. We were running a competition with Dominica because we were wondering, oh gosh, Dominica got hit now, so everything's going to go to them. So we had to keep the pressure on. Listen, we're still here. We're still out here. We still need help. And this is the reality. You have to make sure that people continuously hear from you. The biggest challenge, I think, for us going forward is going to be on housing. And when I looked at the reports from Cayman Islands as we were developing our own plans, and when I looked at what happened in Grenada, you saw that housing became a very important component, and it was carried on for many, many years. So we need to come up with a mechanism that will support that. The damage to the homes is extensive. You know, we spoke about UNDP and the support given on the ground, the UK supporting the Red Cross with these cash programs, but there's a need for physical labor. There's a need for ground transportation. I don't think there's any vehicle in the BVI that hasn't been affected. I can't, Minister, you have any? No, I don't think there's any that hasn't been affected. Shelters, we had strong shelters. We assessed those buildings, but when you got a category 5++ hitting you, they're going to go down. So the shelter needs became very, very important, and we have to get those shelters ready. We're going into next year. And that last press release that came out from the scientists about what's going to happen next year is not very comforting. So we have to get our systems back up and running. The support mechanisms that Ronald spoke about, we have to strengthen the National Disaster Management Offices. We have to look at the sector support, the fire services, the police departments. The regional mechanism needs to have the capacity there where you can send in strong technical teams, they can hit the ground running and they can move. Information dissemination, very, very important. Another point that was raised by Stephen. I think sometimes ministers are fearful of putting information out because they don't want a backlash from their community, but also we have to be careful on how information gets out into the international community. And Yvonne spoke about in her presentation about the need for us to pull a coordinating mechanism for our NGOs, because there were people on the ground, I've never heard of them in my life. I've been in this for 25 years and I have never heard of some of these organizations. And they were on the ground and they were capturing data. And they were conducting surveys and they were starting to put that information out. You have to have a mechanism early to be able to coordinate and control that. The information is important, but you have to be careful on how it's being used. I remember years ago, Don French at a director's meeting. Ronald, you remember that? Very passionate about the whole issue of national security of data. We have to be careful that we're not releasing too much out there and then you have consequences that occur following this. Yes, it's a humanitarian phase and you want people to know what's happening, but there's a lot of essential national data that is exposed in that critical period and you have to be careful on how that is controlled. But we also need to make sure that people know what is happening. I would like to ask you to put your hands together and thank the panel. I think they did a fantastic job. Minister, Mr. Jackson, Mr. O'Malley, and Dr. Coleman, thank you very much. Have a wonderful next session.
That's the night. Thank you, Charlie. Good job.